In 1908, a photographer in Salem, Massachusetts took portraits of 17 people. Within 3 weeks, every single one of them was dead. The strange part wasn't just the timing. It was what showed up in the photographs that nobody could see with the naked eye. Dark shapes, shadows that didn't belong. And in every single image, the subject's eyes looked just slightly to the left, as if they were watching something stand beside the camera. Something the photographer couldn't see either, until the day he developed his own portrait. Thomas Rothwell arrived in Salem on a Tuesday in March. He came from Boston with a leather case full of glass plates and a reputation that preceded him. People said his portraits captured something other photographers missed. A depth, a truth. The kind of image that made you feel like you were staring at a person's soul instead of just their face. He set up shop in a narrow building on Essex Street, right above a tobacconist. The sign he hung was simple: Rothwell Photography. Portraits by appointment. Within a week, he had more clients than he could handle. Salem in 1908 was a city trying to forget its past, while tourists kept reminding it of the witch trials centuries before. Everyone wanted their picture taken. It was still novel enough to feel special. His first client was Margaret Hollis. She was 63, a widow, and she wanted a portrait to send to her daughter in New York. She sat in the chair by the window, and Thomas adjusted the camera. The exposure took 30 seconds. Margaret had to stay perfectly still, staring straight ahead at a point just above the lens. When it was done, Thomas told her the photograph would be ready in 3 days. She never came to collect it. 2 days after her sitting, Margaret Hollis died in her sleep. The doctors said it was her heart. Natural causes. Nothing suspicious. Thomas found out when her neighbor came to cancel the appointment for pickup. He offered his condolences and thought nothing more of it. Then Richard Brennan died. He'd sat for a portrait on Thursday. By Sunday, he was dead. A fall down the stairs in his own home. His neck broke on impact. The police ruled it an accident. Richard had been drinking. Everyone knew he had a problem with the bottle. Thomas started to notice a pattern after the 5th death. 5 clients, 5 portraits, 5 deaths. All within days of their sitting. He pulled out the glass plate negatives and examined them in his dark room under the red safety light. The images looked normal at first. Sharp focus, good exposure, proper composition. But when he looked closer, really looked, he saw something that made his hands shake. In Margaret Hollis's portrait, there was a shadow behind her left shoulder. It wasn't supposed to be there. The wall behind her had been completely bare. He remembered that clearly because he'd chosen that spot specifically for the clean background. The shadow was roughly the shape of a person, but blurred, like someone had moved during a long exposure. Except Margaret had been the only person in the room. He checked Richard Brennan's negative. Same thing. A dark shape, this time at the edge of the frame. Barely visible, but definitely there. All 5 negatives had them. Shadows, shapes, things that shouldn't exist. Thomas stopped taking appointments. He told people he was sick. He spent 3 days locked in his dark room, going through every negative, every print. The shadows appeared in the photographs, but never during the actual sittings. He would have seen them. He would have noticed someone standing there. But the camera saw something he didn't. On the 4th day, someone knocked on his door. Thomas almost didn't answer, but the knocking continued, steady and insistent, until he finally went downstairs. A man stood on the street. He was thin, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive but outdated. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes had a strange quality to them. They didn't reflect light the way eyes should. "Mr. Rothwell," the man said, "I need a portrait." Thomas wanted to refuse. Every instinct told him to close the door, but something about the man's voice made it impossible to say no. The words came out before he could stop them. "Come in." The man's name was John Ashford. At least that's what he said. He climbed the stairs to the studio without making a sound. His footsteps should have creaked on the old wooden boards, but they didn't. Thomas set up the camera with shaking hands. "Why do you want a portrait?" Thomas asked, trying to make conversation, trying to feel normal. "Evidence," John Ashford said. "Proof that I was here." Thomas didn't know what that meant. He didn't ask. He just positioned John in the chair and adjusted the exposure. 30 seconds. John Ashford stared at the camera without blinking. Not once. Thomas counted the seconds in his head, and when it was done, John stood up. "When will it be ready?" he asked. 3 days. John nodded and walked to the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back. "You should stop," he said, "before you take your own." Then he was gone. Thomas developed the plate that night. He couldn't wait. He had to see what the camera captured. The image appeared in the chemical bath slowly, lines and shadows forming in the dim red light. John Ashford's face came into focus first, then his shoulders, then the background. The shadow behind John wasn't blurred. It was sharp, clear, distinct. The shape of a person, but wrong. Too tall, arms too long, and where the face should be, there was nothing but darkness. Pure black, like a hole in the photograph itself. Thomas dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor, glass and chemicals spreading across the dark room. He backed against the wall, breathing hard, trying to understand what he'd just seen. Something was following these people, something that showed up in photographs, but nowhere else. And everyone who got their picture taken ended up dead. John Ashford never came back for his portrait. Thomas checked the records. There was no John Ashford living in Salem. No one by that name had died recently. It was like he didn't exist at all. But Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "Before you take your own." He'd been so focused on his clients that he'd never considered himself. He'd taken dozens of photographs over the years. Self-portraits, tests, experiments. Had the shadow been following him too? Had he just never noticed? Thomas went through his personal negatives. Most of them were old, from before he came to Salem. He held them up to the light one by one. Nothing. Clean images. Normal shadows. Then he found the one he'd taken last month, right after setting up the studio. A self-portrait to test the new camera angle. The shadow was there, right behind him, close enough to touch. 3 weeks had passed since that photograph, the same amount of time between his clients' portraits and their deaths. 3 weeks. If you're keeping track of the timeline, people didn't just die randomly after sitting for a portrait with Thomas. There was a pattern to how and when it happened. Each death seemed natural at first glance, but dig deeper and strange details emerged. Margaret Hollis died in her sleep, but her neighbor reported hearing her talking to someone in the hours before, having a full conversation with a voice that responded. Richard Brennan fell down stairs he'd climbed drunk 100 times before, without incident. The third victim, Sarah Mills, drowned in her bathtub. She was 42 and in perfect health. The fourth, Henry Chen, was struck by a streetcar he should have easily seen coming. The fifth, Elizabeth Worth, simply stopped breathing during dinner with her family. The deaths looked accidental, natural. But they all shared one thing. In the hours before they died, each person reported feeling watched, followed. Several told family members about seeing someone in the corner of their vision who vanished when they turned to look. Thomas realized the shadow wasn't just appearing in photographs. It was real. It was actually there, following these people, invisible until the camera captured it. And once it appeared in a photograph, once it was documented, it had 3 weeks to finish what it started. He had less than a day left. Thomas thought about running, leaving Salem, leaving Massachusetts, putting as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was hunting him. But John Ashford's words kept echoing in his mind. Proof that I was here. Maybe John had been like Thomas. Maybe he'd been a photographer too, or someone else who'd accidentally captured something that shouldn't be seen. Maybe he'd found a way to survive. There was one possibility Thomas kept coming back to. What if the shadow needed the photograph to complete its work? What if destroying the negative would break the connection? It was worth trying. Thomas gathered all the glass plates, the portraits of his dead clients, his own self-portrait, everything that showed the shadow. He built a fire in the stove and prepared to throw them in, but as he held the first negative over the flames, he hesitated. What if destroying the photographs made it worse? What if the shadow was trapped in the images somehow, and breaking the glass would set it free? He didn't have time to debate. The 3 weeks were almost up. He had to make a choice. Thomas smashed the first plate on the floor instead. Margaret Hollis's portrait. The glass shattered, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature in the room dropped so fast his breath came out in clouds. The lights flickered. Every candle went out at once. In the darkness, Thomas heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. He grabbed the second plate and threw it against the wall. Richard Brennan's portrait exploded into fragments. The footsteps got louder, closer. Thomas could hear breathing now. Not his own. Something else. Something that sounded wrong, like air being pulled through a throat that wasn't built for it. He destroyed the third plate. The fourth. The fifth. Each time, the presence got stronger. The air felt thick, almost solid. Thomas could barely move, like he was pushing through invisible resistance. His hands were numb from cold. One plate left, his own portrait. The self-image that showed the shadow standing right behind him. The door to his studio opened even though he'd locked it. No one came through, but Thomas could feel something in the doorway. Watching. Waiting. If you've ever wondered why certain photographs feel wrong, why some images make your skin crawl even though there's nothing obviously disturbing about them, it's because cameras see things we don't. They capture light and shadow without the filter of human perception. They record everything, even the things our brains refuse to acknowledge. Thomas held his own negative above his head. The shadow in the photograph looked darker than before, more defined. He could almost see features now, a suggestion of a face, eyes that seemed to look directly out of the image at him. "What do you want?" he whispered. The breathing stopped. In the silence, Thomas heard a voice, not spoken, not out loud, but in his head, clear as if someone was standing next to him. To be seen. Thomas understood then. The shadow wasn't trying to kill anyone. It was trying to exist. These people, these victims, they'd all died because they'd given the shadow what it needed. Acknowledgement. Recognition. Proof that it was real. And once it had that proof, once it had been documented, it consumed the person who'd witnessed it. Their life force became its substance. Their death gave it form. But Thomas had figured it out. He knew what it was, and knowing meant he had a choice. He could destroy the negative and hope that broke the connection, or he could keep it, live with it, carry the proof of the shadow's existence without letting it consume him. The thing in the doorway moved closer. Thomas could see it now, just barely, a shape darker than the darkness around it. Tall, thin, made of something that wasn't quite solid and wasn't quite smoke. Thomas lowered the negative. He walked to his camera, hands steady despite everything. He loaded a fresh glass plate, aimed it at the shadow standing in his studio. "If you want to be seen," he said, "let me see you clearly." The shadow moved into position. Thomas didn't know if it was agreeing or if it simply couldn't resist the pull of being documented. He opened the shutter. 30 seconds. The longest 30 seconds of his life. The shadow stood perfectly still, and Thomas watched as it became more solid with each passing moment, feeding off the act of being photographed. When the exposure ended, Thomas immediately loaded another plate. And another. He took 6 photographs in total, 6 different angles, 6 pieces of evidence. The shadow grew stronger with each image, more real, more present. By the 6th photograph, Thomas could see it clearly without the camera. It had a face now, human but not, eyes that reflected nothing, a mouth that didn't move even though Thomas could still hear its voice in his head. "Why?" it asked. "Because you wanted proof," Thomas said. Now everyone will have it. He spent the entire night in his dark room, developing all 6 negatives. The shadow watched him work. It didn't try to stop him. Maybe it couldn't. Maybe the act of being photographed so many times had changed something, given it too much form, made it visible but vulnerable. When dawn came, Thomas had 6 perfect prints, clear images of something that shouldn't exist. He took them to the Salem Evening News, walked right into the newspaper office and put the photographs on the editor's desk. "What am I looking at?" the editor asked. "The truth," Thomas said. The photographs ran in the next day's edition. Front page. The headline read, "Local photographer captures unknown entity." The article detailed Thomas's story, the deaths of his clients, the shadow that appeared in every portrait. Some people called it a hoax. Others called it proof of the supernatural. The debate raged for weeks. But Thomas noticed something. After the photographs were published, after they were seen by thousands of people, the shadow began to fade. Not disappear, fade. Like an image left in sunlight too long. Being seen by so many people at once diluted its power, spread it thin. It couldn't consume Thomas because it was being consumed itself by the attention of an entire city. Thomas lived. The shadow didn't come for him. He closed his portrait studio and stopped taking photographs of people altogether. But he kept those 6 images, stored them in a locked drawer. Evidence, proof. Years passed. Thomas left Salem, moved west, started over. He heard reports occasionally of photographers in other cities experiencing similar things. Shadows in portraits, unexplained deaths. But none of them figured out what he had. None of them survived. In 1935, Thomas Rothwell died of natural causes at the age of 68. When they cleaned out his house, they found a collection of glass plate negatives in the basement. Hundreds of them. Most were standard portraits, landscapes, ordinary photographs. But 12 of them showed shadows that didn't belong. Shapes that shouldn't exist. Things the camera saw but the eye couldn't. Those 12 plates were donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society. They're still there today, stored in a climate-controlled vault. Researchers have examined them, tried to explain the anomalies as chemical defects, light leaks, or double exposures. None of those explanations fit the evidence. But here's the thing they don't tell you in the official records. Every researcher who spent significant time studying those plates has reported the same experience, the feeling of being watched, followed. And when they look in mirrors or reflective surfaces, just for a second, they see something standing behind them that isn't there when they turn around. The Historical Society stopped allowing access to the plates in 1987 after a graduate student working on a thesis about early 20th century photography techniques had a breakdown. She insisted something had followed her home from the archives, something that appeared in every photograph she took after that, always in the background, always watching. They found her cameras in her apartment. She'd destroyed them all, smashed them to pieces. There was a note, written in shaky handwriting on the back of a printed photograph. The photograph showed her bedroom, empty except for a shape in the corner, dark, tall, familiar. The note said, "It wants to be seen. Don't look." She disappeared 3 weeks later. The plates are still in the vault, still waiting, still capturing something on glass and silver that maybe should have stayed invisible, because Thomas Rothwell discovered something in 1908 that we still don't fully understand. Cameras don't just record light. They record presence, existence. And some things exist in ways we're not meant to perceive, until we point a lens at them. The Massachusetts Historical Society accepts requests to view the Rothwell collection. You just have to fill out a research application, provide academic credentials, sign a waiver. They'll let you into the vault, let you examine the plates, let you see what Thomas Rothwell saw in his dark room over a century ago. And when you're done, when you walk back out into the daylight, you might want to avoid mirrors for a while. Because sometimes, after viewing certain photographs, people notice changes in their own reflections. Small things at first. A shadow that's slightly too long. a darkness in the background that wasn't there before. And if you're really unlucky, if you look long enough, you might see what Thomas saw. Something standing just behind you, waiting patiently for you to acknowledge it, waiting for you to take its picture, waiting to be seen. The researchers who sealed the vault in 1987 installed one additional security measure they don't mention in public records. A camera, positioned to photograph anyone who views the Rothwell plates. Just one photograph, one piece of evidence. They keep those images in a separate file. No one's counted them recently, but last anyone checked, there were 47 portraits in that file. And every single one shows the same shadow, standing behind each researcher, getting clearer with each new image. More solid, more real. They say number 48 will be different. Number 48 is when